Nobody in that mansion believed a woman like her belonged there. Elena Whitmore stood at the bottom of the marble staircase, her hands folded over a plain cotton dress, her shoes scuffed from years of walking instead of riding. Around her, the Calloway estate rose like a monument to everything she was not supposed to have. Crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of ancestors who had never known hunger, a staircase wide enough to fit an entire village. She was here because in 3 days, she would marry Julian Calloway, heir to one of the largest shipping empires on the East Coast. And every single person in that house, from the housekeeper to Julian's own mother, believed she was marrying him for his money. They had no idea how wrong they were. "You must be the bride," said a voice behind her, dripping with a courtesy so cold it could have frozen the marble beneath her feet. Elena turned. The woman standing there was impeccable. Ash blonde hair pulled into a chignon, a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe, and eyes that scanned her from head to toe in less than 2 seconds, cataloging every flaw. "I'm Margaret," the woman said, "Julian's older sister. And you are Elena, was it?" "Elena Whitmore," she said, extending a hand that trembled only slightly. Margaret looked at the offered hand, as if it were something unpleasant left on a doorstep, then shook it briefly, her grip limp and dismissive. Well, Julian certainly has unconventional taste. Behind Margaret, another woman appeared, younger, sharper around the edges, wearing a dress that seemed engineered to remind everyone in the room that she, too, belonged to old money. This was Vivian, Julian's younger sister, the one the household staff whispered about when they thought no one could hear. "So this is her," Vivian said, not bothering to lower her voice. "The nurse." "I work at St. Agnes Hospital," Elena said evenly. "I'm a pediatric nurse." "How charming," Vivian said, the word charming carrying all the warmth of a slammed door. "And here, we thought Julian would marry someone from his own world." Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the sharpest response a person could give. It denied cruelty the reaction it was hunting for. But what none of them knew, what she had spent months carefully hiding, layer by layer, lie by gentle lie, was that Elena Whitmore had grown up in rooms far grander than this one. That she had walked away from a fortune, from a family name that could buy this entire estate twice over, because she wanted, for once in her life, to be loved for exactly who she was and nothing else. She had told no one, not even Julian, especially not Julian. To understand why Elena Whitmore stood in that mansion pretending to be poor, you would need to go back 3 years to a rainy Tuesday night in the emergency room of St. Agnes Hospital. Julian Calloway had not planned on being there. He had been driving home from a business dinner when his car slid on wet pavement and collided with a guardrail. Nothing serious. A fractured wrist, a gash above his eyebrow. But enough to land him on a gurney at 2 a.m, irritable, expensively dressed, and completely out of his element. Elena had been the nurse assigned to stitch the cut above his eye. "You're going to feel a pinch," she told him, threading the needle with practiced calm. "I'm fine," he said, the way rich men often say they are fine when they have never once had to be. "You're bleeding on my scrubs," she replied, "so you're clearly not fine. Hold still." He had laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh, the kind that seemed to catch him off guard. Nobody talked to Julian Calloway like that. Nobody dared. They talked for the better part of an hour while she worked. He told her, without meaning to, more about himself than he had told people he'd known for years. How exhausted he was of women who memorized his stock portfolio before memorizing his middle name. How lonely a mansion could feel when every room was full of people who wanted something from him. Elena told him almost nothing about herself, not because she was cold, but because she had learned that the moment people discovered where she came from, the version of her they liked disappeared, replaced by dollar signs and assumptions. He came back to the hospital 3 days later with flowers, claiming his wrist needed checking. It didn't. He came back the week after that, too. By the 3rd month, they were inseparable, and Julian Calloway, who could have had any woman in the city, had fallen quietly and completely in love with a nurse who wore second-hand shoes and never once asked him for anything. What he did not know was that those shoes were a choice, not a necessity. That the woman stitching his forehead in a rented one-bedroom apartment had once slept in a bedroom the size of that entire apartment. That her real name, the one on certain legal documents, the one attached to a fortune built across 3 generations, was not simply Elena Whitmore, nurse. It was Elena Whitmore Grayson, sole heir to Grayson Textiles International, a company her own grandfather had built from nothing, and which she had walked away from at 24 years old, unable to bear one more conversation, one more relationship, one more friendship that felt like a transaction wearing a smile. She had wanted, more than anything, to know what it felt like to be chosen for herself. And in Julian, she believed she had finally found it. The bribery attempts began 4 days after the engagement was announced. It started subtly, the way these things always do among people who have spent their entire lives learning to disguise cruelty as concern. "We simply want to understand your intentions," Margaret said one afternoon, having invited Elena to what she called a friendly tea in the estate's east parlor. The tea set alone, Elena noted silently, was worth more than a year of her nursing salary. "My intentions are to marry the man I love," Elena said simply. Margaret's smile did not reach her eyes. "Of course, and I'm sure that love has absolutely nothing to do with the Calloway Trust Fund, or the shipping company, or the 4 properties Julian will inherit." "I didn't know about any of that until after we were engaged," Elena said, which was, technically, a half-truth wrapped around a larger one. "How convenient," Vivian said from the doorway, arms crossed, watching the exchange like a hawk circling something wounded. That was the day the offer first appeared, slid across the antique tea table in a plain white envelope, no note attached, as if the money itself was meant to speak on Margaret's behalf. Elena opened it later, in the privacy of the guest bathroom, her hands shaking not from temptation, but from disbelief. Inside was a cashier's check for $200,000. She almost laughed. $200,000. An amount that would have felt like an insult to the woman she truly was, whose family had built and sold entire divisions of a textile empire for sums with far more zeros. But to the woman she was pretending to be, a struggling nurse with student loans and a modest studio apartment, it was supposed to feel like a fortune. Enough to disappear quietly, enough to make the gold digger go away before she could embarrass the family name. She tore the check in half and mailed the pieces back to Margaret in an unmarked envelope, with no note of her own. The message was received. And the war, quiet and elegant and vicious in the way only old money knows how to be vicious, truly began. Over the following weeks, the attempts grew bolder, more creative, more desperate. Vivian arranged for Elena to be accidentally seated at a charity gala beside a tabloid journalist known for digging up scandal, hoping some careless comment might hand her a story. Elena, trained by years of navigating hospital politics and grieving families, gave the journalist nothing but pleasant, guarded small talk. Margaret hired a private investigator to look into Elena's background, expecting to unearth debt, scandal, perhaps a hidden ex-husband, or a criminal record that could be leveraged. What the investigator found instead was strange and thin. A woman who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere at 26, with sparse records before that. as though an entire chapter of her life had been carefully, deliberately erased. "She's hiding something," Margaret told her mother, Eleanor Calloway, the family matriarch, during one of their strategy sessions in the study. "Nobody's past is this empty unless they're running from something or building a lie." Eleanor, older and colder, and infinitely more calculating than her daughters, simply steepled her fingers. "Then let's raise the offer. Everyone has a price, Margaret. We simply haven't found hers." The second offer arrived not as a check, but as a proposition, delivered by Margaret herself over dinner while Julian was traveling for business. $500,000, Margaret said, cutting into her filet mignon without looking up. "Tax-free, structured however your lawyer prefers. All you have to do is walk away quietly. Tell Julian you've had a change of heart. No scandal. No mess. You simply disappear, and we all move forward with our lives." Elena set down her fork. "You think I can be bought?" "I think everyone can be bought," Margaret said. "I've simply been offering the wrong currency." "I love your brother," Elena said, and for the first time her voice cracked slightly. Not from weakness, but from the exhausting effort of holding back everything she actually could have said. That she had grown up around women exactly like Margaret. That she recognized this exact brand of cruelty, dressed up as pragmatism, because she had watched her own late mother wield it against people who dared to love someone in her family without a prenuptial contract in hand. That she could buy this entire estate and never notice the dent in her accounts. But she said none of it, because the moment she revealed who she truly was, this fight, this test of whether Julian's love and his family's love could survive without money as the deciding factor, would be over, and she would never truly know the answer. "Love," Margaret repeated, as if tasting an unfamiliar word. How touching. Ask yourself, Elena, if Julian didn't have a single cent, would you still be sitting at this table? "Yes," Elena said without hesitation. "Would you love him the same if he didn't?" Margaret's silence answered the question far better than words could have. By the third week, the pressure had begun to fracture something inside Elena. Not her resolve, but her heart, worn thin by the constant, grinding cruelty of people who were supposed to become her family. She had not told Julian about the bribes, not the first, not the second, not the whispered threats Vivian left in her wake like perfume, comments about how some marriages simply don't survive the first year, and how it would be such a shame if Julian's business partner started asking questions about his fiancée's mysterious past. She carried it alone because she did not want Julian to be forced into choosing between his family and her. Not yet. Not until she understood how deep this cruelty truly ran. But one night, sitting alone on the fire escape outside her small apartment, the city lights blurring through tears she refused to let fall inside where anyone could see, Elena allowed herself, for the first time, to consider walking away. Not because of the money, not because of the insults, but because she was so tired, bone tired, of being reduced to a suspect, a gold digger, an opportunist, when all she had ever wanted was to be loved without an agenda attached. She thought about her grandfather, the man who built Grayson Textiles from a single loom in a rented warehouse, and the words he used to tell her when she was young. "Money reveals character, Elena. It doesn't build it. Watch how people behave when they think it's on the line. That's who they really are." She thought about her own mother, who had married into money and spent 30 joyless years being reminded in 1,000 small ways that she would never truly belong. Elena did not want that life. She had run from that life. And now, ironically, she was living a version of it in reverse, hated not for having money, but for supposedly wanting it. She almost called Julian that night to end the engagement, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't bear to watch what his family might become if she stayed and fought. Instead, she called her lawyer, and she made a decision that would change everything. His name was Charles Whitfield, and he had managed the Grayson family's legal affairs for 11 years, long enough to know Elena's real identity better than anyone else alive, including, at that point, Julian himself. "I need you to prepare something for me," Elena told him over the phone, her voice steadier now, sharpened by resolve rather than sadness. "Not to expose them? Not yet. I want to know exactly how far they'll go first." "Elena," Charles said carefully, "you know you don't have to prove anything to these people. You could end this entire charade with one phone call and a bank statement." "I know," she said, "but I need Julian to see it. Not be told about it. See it. I need him to watch his family try to buy me off, and I need to know, before I marry into that family, whether he chooses money and blood loyalty, or whether he chooses me." There was a long pause on the line. "And if he doesn't choose you, then I'll be grateful I found out before the wedding instead of after," Elena said quietly. "But I don't think that's who he is. I think his family made him believe love and money have to be tangled together. I want to show him they don't." Charles agreed to prepare everything: documents, records, verified proof of the Grayson Whitmore fortune, ready to be revealed at precisely the right moment. Elena's plan was simple and devastatingly patient. She would let Margaret and Vivian's cruelty play out fully, without interference, without revealing her hand. She would let them believe, right up until the final moment, that they held all the power in this fight. And then, in front of the entire wedding, in front of every relative and business partner and society columnist who had ever whispered the word "gold digger" behind a gloved hand, she would show them exactly who they had been trying to bribe all along. Before the final offer came the engagement party, an event Margaret had insisted on hosting for appearances, though everyone in the family understood its true purpose: to parade Elena in front of the Calloway social circle like an exhibit at a museum of curiosities, and to watch, with barely concealed satisfaction, as she failed to belong. The ballroom that night glittered with old money in its purest form. Women in heirloom jewelry that had passed through 4 generations, men discussing acquisitions and mergers as casually as the weather, and an orchestra playing music that Elena recognized instantly, though she was careful never to hum along. Vivian orchestrated a small cruelty with surgical precision. She arranged for Elena to be seated at a table entirely composed of Calloway business partners and their wives, women who spoke fluently about wine vintages, private islands, and boarding schools in Switzerland, conversations designed to make Elena feel every inch the outsider she was pretending to be. "And where did you attend university, dear?" asked a woman named Constance Ashford Beaumont, her tone polite on the surface and condescending underneath, the way certain women could compliment and insult in the very same sentence. "State University," Elena said simply. "Nursing program." A small, almost imperceptible silence followed, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any comment could have. "How resourceful," Constance said finally, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. Elena smiled and said nothing further, though inside a quiet, private amusement stirred. She had, in fact, attended one of the most exclusive preparatory schools on the East Coast before walking away from that entire world, and she could have discussed private islands and wine vintages with more authority than anyone at that table. But that was precisely the test she had set for herself: to see how these people treated someone they believed had nothing, and to remember every single moment of it. Later that evening, as the party wound toward its end, Margaret pulled Elena aside under the pretense of showing her the family portrait gallery, a corridor lined with painted Calloway ancestors, staring down with the same cold appraisal Elena had grown used to receiving from the living members of the family. "You handled tonight rather well," Margaret said, studying a portrait of Julian's great-grandfather, rather than looking at Elena directly. Better than I expected, honestly. Was that meant as a compliment? Elena asked. Take it however you like. Margaret finally turned to face her. But surely you understand, Elena, that this world isn't built for people like you. You'll spend the rest of your life being quietly reminded that you don't belong in 1,000 small ways, at every dinner, every gala, every family gathering for the next 50 years. Is that truly the life you want? I think, Elena said carefully, that you're describing the life you've built for yourself, Margaret, not the one I intend to live. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the closest anyone in the family had come, so far, to hearing the quiet steel beneath Elena's calm exterior, and it unsettled her far more than she let on. Despite her resolve, there were nights when Elena questioned everything, whether her plan was cruel in its own way, whether she was testing Julian and his family unfairly by withholding the truth, whether love that required this much proof was even the kind of love worth having at all. She called her old friend and former roommate, Priya, one of only 2 people outside her lawyer who knew her real identity. You could end this with one phone call, Priya reminded her gently over the phone. One bank statement. You don't have to keep absorbing their cruelty to prove a point. I know, Elena admitted, curled up on her small apartment sofa, exhaustion evident in her voice. But Priya, if I show them the money now, I'll never actually know if Julian loves me, or if his family will only tolerate me because of what I bring to the marriage. I need this test to be real. Otherwise, it's just another transaction dressed up as romance, exactly like the ones I ran from 3 years ago. And if it breaks you before you get your answer? Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then at least I'll know the truth before I spend the rest of my life pretending I don't. Priya sighed, the familiar, worried sigh of a friend who disagreed, but understood. Just promise me, you won't let them convince you that you're not worth loving. Money or no money. Elena, you never were the problem in that house. They were. Elena held on to those words in the weeks that followed, repeating them quietly to herself every time Vivian's comments cut deep. Every time Margaret's smile carried a blade behind it. Every time she wondered whether she was strong enough to see this through to the end. 2 days before the wedding, Julian Calloway summoned Elena to the study personally, a rare honor, or so Margaret implied, with a raised eyebrow, as though Elena should feel flattered to be humiliated by the matriarch instead of merely her daughters. Eleanor sat behind a mahogany desk that had belonged to her late husband, her posture perfectly straight, her expression unreadable. Sit down, Miss Whitmore. Elena sat. I'll be direct, since subtlety has clearly failed with you, Eleanor said. $1 million, wired to any account you choose, structured to avoid any tax complications, effective the moment you leave this house, and never return. And if I refuse? Elena asked. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Then I will make it my life's work to ensure every hospital, every landlord, every friend you have in this city understands exactly what kind of woman tried to trap my son. You'd ruin a woman you know nothing about, Elena said softly, to protect a fortune you didn't build. Something flickered in Eleanor's expression, not quite doubt, but close enough to it that Elena filed the moment away carefully. I built this family's reputation with my own 2 hands, Miss Whitmore. I will not watch it collapse because my son fell for the first kind face that smiled at him in a hospital bed. He didn't fall for a kind face, Elena said, standing now, her voice quiet but unshakable. He fell in love with someone who never once asked him what he was worth. Maybe that's foreign to this family, but it isn't a crime. She walked out of that study with her heart pounding, but her spine straighter than it had been in weeks. That night, she finally told Julian everything. Not the truth about her identity. Not yet. But everything about the bribes, the threats, the months of quiet cruelty she had absorbed alone to protect him from having to choose. Julian sat in stunned silence on the edge of her bed, his hands trembling with a fury Elena had never seen in him before. "They did this," he said, "and you never told me." "I didn't want you to have to pick a side before the wedding even happened," Elena said. "There is no picking, Elena," Julian said, taking her hands in his. "There is no version of my family that matters more to me than you. I don't care what they offer you, or threaten you with, or how much money is on that table. If they can't accept you, they can watch from outside the church, because I am not marrying anyone else, in any lifetime, in any version of this world." It was, Elena would later say, the moment she knew, truly knew, that she had found exactly what she'd been searching for since she walked away from her family's fortune 3 years earlier. A love untethered from money entirely. Now, all that remained was the wedding itself, and the truth she had carried in silence for so long. The morning of the wedding, the Calloway estate had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. White orchids cascading down every column, string quartets tuning quietly in the garden, 300 guests arriving in cars worth more than most people's homes. Margaret and Vivian moved through the preparations with tight, false smiles, whispering to each other about how quickly they expected this marriage to unravel, how certain they were that Elena's true colors would surface eventually, once the fairy tale wore off and the bills started arriving. They had no idea the fairy tale had never been about money to begin with, and that they were about to learn exactly how wrong they had been in front of everyone who mattered to them. Elena stood in the bridal suite, her wedding gown simple but elegant, nothing like the elaborate designer creations Margaret had helpfully suggested weeks earlier, each one subtly designed to make Elena look as though she were playing dress-up in a world she didn't belong to. Charles Whitfield arrived precisely on schedule, carrying a slim leather folder. "Are you certain about this?" he asked one final time. "More certain than I've been about anything in years," Elena said. The ceremony itself unfolded exactly as weddings do. Vows exchanged with trembling voices, Julian's eyes glistening as he promised to love Elena in sickness and health, wealth and poverty. A vow that carried a weight only the two of them fully understood. The guests wept. Even Eleanor, seated in the front row with her jaw tight, seemed momentarily moved despite herself. But it was during the reception, as champagne flowed and toasts were raised, that Elena Whitmore finally revealed the truth she had carried for months. She stood, glass in hand, and asked for everyone's attention. "Before we continue celebrating," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "I think there's something the Calloway family, and everyone here, deserves to know." Margaret's smile faltered instantly. Vivian's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. "Several weeks ago," Elena continued, "I was offered $200,000 to disappear quietly from Julian's life. When I refused, the offer became $500,000. 2 days ago, it became $1 million, along with a promise to destroy my reputation if I didn't accept." A ripple of shocked murmur spread through the crowd. Eleanor's face had gone pale, her composure cracking for the first time anyone could remember. "I refused every offer," Elena said, "not because the amount wasn't generous enough, though I'm sure Margaret and Eleanor believed that was the issue, but because no amount of money was ever going to buy the thing I actually wanted, which was simply to be loved without a price tag attached." She nodded to Charles, who stepped forward and handed her the leather folder. "My name is Elena Whitmore Grayson," she said. opening it to reveal documents that would soon be passed among stunned relatives and business partners. My grandfather founded Grayson Textiles International. When he passed, I inherited a controlling stake in a company valued, as of this year, at just over $400 million. The garden went utterly silent. I walked away from that world 3 years ago, Elena continued, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her own ears. Because I was exhausted of being loved, or pretended to be loved, for what I had, rather than who I was. So when I met Julian, I told him almost nothing about my past. I let him fall in love with a nurse who took the bus to work and rented a 1-bedroom apartment, because I needed to know for certain that it was me he wanted, not my name or my money. She looked directly at Margaret, then Vivian, then finally Eleanor. You spent weeks trying to buy off a woman you assumed had nothing, Elena said. The truth is, I could have purchased this entire estate several times over without noticing the difference in my accounts, but none of that ever mattered to me, as much as knowing whether your family could love Julian's choice, regardless of what was in her bank account. Julian, who had known nothing of this final revelation, stared at his new wife with an expression caught somewhere between shock and overwhelming pride. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of everyone. I didn't marry a fortune, he said, his voice carrying across the stunned garden. I married a woman who never once cared about mine. That's worth more than every dollar my family has ever tried to weaponize. Eleanor Calloway sat frozen at the head table, the weight of her own cruelty settling over her in front of 300 witnesses. For the first time in decades, she had no clever remark, no cutting retort, only the slow, painful realization that she had spent weeks trying to humiliate a woman with more wealth, more grace, and more dignity than her entire family combined. 2 weeks after the wedding, once the tabloids had moved on to newer scandals and the initial shockwaves had settled into something closer to grudging acceptance, Julian and Elena finally left for the honeymoon they had postponed, amid the chaos of the revelation, a quiet villa on the coast of Portugal, far from ballrooms and family portraits and whispered judgments. It was there, watching the sun set over the Atlantic with a glass of wine neither of them could quite finish, that Julian finally asked the question that had lingered unspoken since the reception. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. "Not about the bribes, I understand that. I mean about who you really are, your family, the company, all of it." Elena considered the question carefully, wanting to give him an answer as honest as the one he deserved. "Because for the first time in my adult life, someone loved me without knowing any of it," she said. "You didn't fall in love with an heiress, Julian. You fell in love with a nurse who stitched your forehead and told you to stop complaining. I needed to know that version of us was real before I let the rest of the world back in." "And now that it is real?" he asked. "Now that the world knows?" Elena smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded over the water. "Now, I get to build a foundation with the money my grandfather worked his whole life for, and I get to do it with a husband who never once needed to know the number in my bank account to know he loved me. That feels like the best possible ending to a story that started with someone trying to buy me off a hospital gurney." Julian laughed, pulling her closer. "For the record, my family owes you far more than an apology." "They already gave me the only thing that mattered," Elena said quietly. "They showed me exactly who they were before I ever had to guess." In the days that followed, the story spread through social circles like wildfire, not through tabloids, though they certainly tried, but through the quiet, devastating power of truth finally spoken aloud. Margaret attempted, weeks later, to reach out to Elena with a stiff, carefully worded apology, that read more like damage control than genuine remorse. Elena responded with grace she didn't entirely feel, because despite everything, she understood something Margaret likely never would. That people who have never known what it feels like to be loved unconditionally often spend their lives testing others for a betrayal they themselves would commit first. Eleanor Calloway, to her credit, made the only gesture that mattered. She requested a private meeting with Elena, without Julian present, without an audience to perform for. "I was wrong about you," Eleanor said simply, the words clearly costing her more than any amount of money ever could. "I judged you before I understood a single thing about who you actually were. I owe you an apology, and more importantly, I owe my son the acknowledgement that he saw something in you long before the rest of us were wise enough to look for it." "Thank you," Elena said. "But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. It was never about proving I had money. It was about proving that love shouldn't require proof of anything at all." Vivian, notably, never fully softened. Some people, Elena had learned long ago, hold on to resentment not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about themselves. But even Vivian, in her own quiet way, stopped the whispered comments, stopped the thinly veiled insults, if only because she could no longer justify them to herself. A year after the wedding, Elena still worked 3 shifts a week at St. Agnes Hospital, not because she needed the income, but because those small hospital rooms, filled with frightened children and exhausted parents, had taught her more about genuine human connection than any mansion ever had. She and Julian eventually merged their 2 worlds, the shipping empire and the textile fortune, into a combined philanthropic foundation that funded pediatric care across dozens of hospitals, a decision that felt, to both of them, like the truest use of money either family had ever made. Sometimes at galas or family dinners, someone would recognize her name from the story that had rippled through their social circle. The nurse who turned out to be an heiress, the bride who refused $1 million, the woman who taught an entire family that love could not be purchased no matter how large the number written on the check. Elena never grew tired of one particular question people always seemed to ask her. "Weren't you tempted, even once, by all that money?" Her answer never changed. "The money was never the temptation," she would say, smiling at Julian across whatever room they happened to be standing in. "The temptation was believing, even for a moment, that I had to prove I deserved to be loved, and that's a price I was never willing to pay." In the end, the family that had tried so hard to buy her silence had instead given her the one thing money could never provide: undeniable, irrefutable proof that the love she had found was real, tested under the harshest fire old money could produce, and it had not only survived, it had triumphed. Years later, when people asked Elena why she never resented the Calloway women for what they had put her through, she would simply smile and explain that their cruelty had, in its own strange way, been a gift. It had forced her to discover exactly how far she was willing to go to protect something real, and it had handed her, on a silver platter she never asked for, undeniable proof that Julian's love had never once depended on anything a bank statement could measure. Some inheritances come in the form of money, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Elena's greatest inheritance turned out to be different entirely. The certainty, hard-won and unshakable, that she was worthy of love exactly as she was, long before anyone in that mansion ever learned her real name.